My older sister didn't say it quietly. She said it across my parents' dining room table on Thanksgiving Sunday, in front of 34 people, with a glass of Pinot Gris in her hand and a smile on her face like she'd been saving it all week. The table had been full and loud a moment before. It went quiet the way rooms do when someone finally says the thing that everyone secretly knew was coming. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. A cousin looked down at her plate. My father picked up his water glass and put it back down without drinking from it. My sister added, "You're 33 years old, and you're still alone." "I'm just saying what everyone's already thinking." I looked at her. I kept my expression steady, and then I said very calmly, "Actually, I got engaged 6 months ago." The room went completely still. "My name is Tatum Okafor. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a senior policy analyst for the federal government in Ottawa. For the past 8 years, I have spent my days reviewing public infrastructure proposals, writing briefing notes for cabinet ministers, and flying between provinces to consult with municipalities on housing and transit strategy. It is not the kind of work that makes people lean forward at parties. When I try to explain it, eyes tend to drift, but it is serious work that affects real people, and I am good at it, and I built that career entirely on my own." None of that ever seemed to register with my family. Growing up, success in our house had a very particular shape. My older sister, Kristen, had followed the expected path without deviation, married at 29 to a man my parents adored from the moment they met him, 2 children before she turned 35. A semi-detached in Oakville, with a finished basement and a stone patio her husband spent one entire long weekend installing. My parents spoke about her life with an ease and warmth that I noticed. Over the years, they never quite applied to mine. Not because they didn't love me. I believe they did. But love and attention are not the same thing. And they had a way of giving Kristen both at once, while giving me one and calling it the other. I had taken a different road. My master's degree took 2 years longer than I expected. My first real federal position paid just enough to cover rent in a city where the cost of everything had been climbing steadily since I arrived. I didn't date seriously through most of my 20s because I was genuinely building something that required my full attention. And I was also, if I'm honest, somewhat private about those parts of my life. I had learned early that bringing someone home before I was certain about them meant answering questions about that person long after the relationship was over. I had learned that sharing good news too soon meant watching it get quietly absorbed into a conversation about what I still hadn't done. Kristen had a particular gift for that kind of redirection. She wasn't cruel in any obvious way. She never raised her voice or said anything outright hateful. She just had this habit of waiting until a gathering had reached its comfortable middle. Enough wine, enough food, enough of a crowd, and then finding her way to the subject of my personal life. "Still just focusing on work, are you?" she'd ask, with that careful tilt of her head that looked like sisterly concern, and felt to me like something else. A few people would smile. Someone would make a gentle joke. My mother would change the subject about 20 seconds too late. My father would refill his coffee. Nobody ever told her to stop. I had stopped expecting them to. I had also, somewhere along the way, stopped expecting anyone in that room to fully see what I had actually built. I had just kept building it quietly, and I had gotten very good at the kind of patience that looks like peace. I met Elliot on a February evening on Bank Street in a snowstorm, at the prescription counter of a pharmacy where the computer system had gone completely down and nobody knew how long it would be before it came back up. He was standing 2 people ahead of me in the line. He turned around at some point to check the progress, caught my expression and said, "I think it might be a while." "I'm gathering that," I said. We stood there for 40 minutes. He was finishing a fellowship in pediatric surgery at CHEO, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and had recently come back from a research year in Vancouver. He spoke quietly and listened without interrupting, which I noticed because it's rarer than it should be. He asked what I did, and when I explained it, he didn't gloss over it the way most people did. He asked a specific question about a transit corridor project that had been in the news that week, and it was a genuinely good question, the kind that assumed I knew what I was talking about. By the time the system came back up, I had already decided I wanted to have that conversation again. We went for coffee the following week, then dinner the week after. The first few months were careful and unhurried, the way things are when you're both busy and both a little wary of rushing something you can feel might matter. He remembered things I mentioned in passing, a documentary I'd said I wanted to watch, the name of my aunt's cat, the particular neighborhood in the glebe I'd said I'd always liked walking through. He remembered them and brought them back later, gently, not as a performance, but just because he'd actually been listening. Around him, I didn't feel the need to curate myself. I could say what I actually thought without watching to see how it landed. That sounds like a small thing. But when you've spent years around people who measure what you say against a version of you they've already decided on, it is not a small thing at all. He came to my parents' house the following Christmas just for dinner, just briefly. He was easy with people and held his own in conversation without trying to fill every silence. On the drive back to Ottawa, he was quiet for a few minutes. Then he asked, carefully, "Does your sister always talk over you like that?" I said something about it just being the family dynamic, how we'd all grown up that way, how she didn't really mean anything by it. He looked at the road for a moment. "You finished 3 sentences tonight, and she redirected all 3 of them. You didn't even flinch." I had noticed. I just hadn't let myself react to it in so long that the not reacting had become its own kind of automatic. He never told me what to do about my family. He never suggested I owed them less of myself, or that I should walk away from any of it. But he paid attention. And he checked in after family gatherings in a way that made it clear my experience of those days mattered to him. That alone changed something in me, slowly the way most real things change. When he proposed, we were on a trail in Gatineau Park on a Sunday morning in April, somewhere in the stretch between the parking lot and the ridge. He had brought coffee in a thermos and a ring in the inside pocket of his jacket, and the trail was still mostly mud from the spring melt. He didn't make a production of it. He just stopped walking and asked. I said yes before he'd gotten all the words out. We decided together not to tell my family right away. Elliot was in the final weeks of a credentialing process that needed his full concentration, and this is the honest part, wanted to hold it privately for a while. I had watched too many good things in my life get absorbed and quietly diminished by the family conversation around them. I wanted one thing that stayed ours until we were ready to share it, not until someone else decided it was time. We also had an offer in on a house, a 3-bedroom semi in the glebe with a backyard and a finished lower level, and a kitchen that needed new countertops but had good bones. The mortgage approval had come through 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I hadn't told a soul. The drive to Hamilton that October Sunday was long and gray, the 401 thick with the particular combination of transport trucks and impatient drivers that it always carries on a holiday weekend. The maple trees along the off-ramps had already turned amber and rust and deep red, and the sky above the escarpment had that flat white look that meant rain before evening. Elliot was on call at CHIO. We had talked about it. He offered to try to find coverage, but I told him it was genuinely fine. I had done 33 Thanksgivings. One more on my own was not going to break me. I arrived to find the house already warm and crowded. My mother took my coat and handed me a casserole dish to carry in a single fluid motion. My aunt was in the kitchen. My uncle was explaining something about his car's winter tires to my father, who had the patient, slightly distant expression of a man who has been hearing about that car for 15 years. Kristen was in the living room with her husband and the kids, and she greeted me with a hug that felt genuine because it was in its way. She didn't dislike me. She just had a particular blindness to certain things, and she'd never had enough reason to correct it. The first hour was easy. We ate, we talked about the kids' schools. The housing market came up, because in Canada it always does, and someone mentioned what a townhouse in Mississauga had listed for, and my father shook his head at the number in the way he always did. I sat across from my cousin Blythe, who was 28, and had always been the quiet observer at these gatherings, taking in more than she showed. I did not mention the mortgage approval. I did not mention the ring, which I had taken off before I left Ottawa, and put in my jacket pocket, not sure what I was going to do with it. The table cleared. People drifted to the living room. The kids went upstairs. Someone put a game on in the background. My mother and her sister had their annual gentle argument about who was going to wash the dishes, which would resolve the same way it always did. I could feel Kristen working up to something. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a shift in pressure, a particular quality to the air. She settled into the center of the room, and the conversation reorganized itself around her, the way it always did. My aunt drifted in, a cousin sat down. My uncle came to stand in the doorway. She started with the usual warm-up. "So how's Ottawa? Still the same department?" "Yes," I said. "Same department, some new projects I was actually quite proud of." She nodded in a way that meant she'd stopped listening. You must get lonely up there, she said. It's a long drive, and you're always up there on your own. I just wonder sometimes. I tried to shift the subject. She brought it back. Within 5 minutes, the circle had grown. 12 people were within clear earshot. Kristen set down her wine glass and looked at me with the expression she reserved for what she considered her most honest moments. Eyebrows slightly raised, voice softened to something that might look like sympathy from a distance. The clock's ticking, Tatum, she said. You're 33 years old, and you're still alone. I'm just saying what everyone's already thinking. The room did not go loud. It went the other kind of quiet, the kind that has weight to it. Someone put their fork down even though we were done eating. Blythe, on the couch, went very still. My mother opened her mouth and then didn't say anything. I reached into the pocket of my jacket. I took out the ring, I slid it onto my finger. Then I looked at Kristen and said quietly, Actually, I got engaged 6 months ago. She laughed first. It was a short, startled sound, more reflex than genuine amusement. You're serious? I am. Then why didn't you say anything? I had thought about how to answer that question for a long time. I had rehearsed versions of it, but the version that came out was the true one, which is almost always the shortest. Because every time something good happens in my life, this family turns it into a conversation about what I'm still missing. I wanted one thing that didn't have to go through that. The room was still. My mother stood up from her chair, slowly, and came across to look at the ring. She didn't say anything at first. My father appeared in the doorway from the hall, having heard enough from the kitchen to understand the shape of what was happening. Kristen said, That's not fair. We would have been happy for you. Would you? Blythe said from the couch. It was the first time I had ever heard my cousin say something like that in a family gathering. It landed cleanly, and everyone heard it. Kristen turned toward her. Excuse me? I'm just asking, because I've been at a lot of these dinners. Blythe's voice was measured, not unkind, and I've watched you do this to her for a long time. Every gathering, you find a way to make a comment about her personal life, every single one. You did it at Christmas last year. You did it at her birthday dinner. You did it at Easter 3 years ago, when she'd just gotten a promotion, and you turned the whole conversation back to why she wasn't dating. Kristen looked around for someone to back her up. Nobody moved quickly enough. My aunt, my mother's older sister, who had driven from Brampton and who I had always assumed was solidly in Kristen's corner, said, She's right. I've thought that for years. I never said anything because I thought it wasn't my place. It's sad when you don't say anything, my uncle said simply from the doorway, not unkindly, just factually, because the person it's being done to doesn't have backup. Kristen shook her head. I was never trying to be cruel. I was trying to. She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because I think even she wasn't entirely sure what she'd been trying to do all those years. Protect me from something? Fill the silence? Perform the role of the sister who was always honest? All of those things can feel like the same thing from the inside. My mother sat down beside me. She looked at her hands for a moment, then she said, I owe you an apology. I looked at her. Not just for tonight, for all of it. Every time she did this, and I didn't stop it, I kept telling myself it was just how sisters are with each other. I kept telling myself you were strong enough to handle it. She paused. That wasn't fair to you. Being strong enough to handle something doesn't mean you should have to. My father nodded from the doorway. He is not a man who makes speeches. He said 3 words. She's right, Tatum. Those 3 words from him carried something that a longer speech wouldn't have. Kristen's husband, who had been quiet through all of it, leaned over and said something low to her. I saw her face change. She looked out the window at the backyard, where the kids were now running through the last of the October light, and she didn't say anything more for a long time. I drove back to Ottawa that night under a low October sky, the highway dark and quiet between cities. I called Elliot from somewhere near Kingston. How was it? He asked. I thought about how to answer. Kristen said the thing she always says. I told him. And I told them about the engagement. He was quiet for a beat, and people actually listened. For the first time, I watched the headlights come and go on the other side of the median. My mother apologized, properly. My aunt said she should have spoken up years ago. How do you feel? I held the phone for a second before answering. Like something heavy got put down, I said. I didn't realize I'd been carrying it until I wasn't. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced with my family before. My aunt called 4 days after Thanksgiving to apologize again, this time with more specifics, moments she'd witnessed and said nothing about, years of staying quiet because she'd convinced herself it wasn't her business. That's the worst reason, she admitted. I should have known better. Blythe sent a long text that ended with, "I'm glad you finally said something. I didn't have the guts to do it myself." My mother called 3 times in the first week. The calls got longer and more honest each time. By the third one, she was asking real questions about Elliot. Not just polite, getting-to-know-you questions, but the kind that meant she actually wanted to understand who he was and why I had chosen him. I told her the pharmacy story. She laughed in the way I hadn't heard her laugh in years, surprised and genuine. In a snowstorm, she said. 40 minutes in a line that wasn't moving. It was a good 40 minutes, I said. Kristen didn't call. I heard from my mother that she and her husband had had some significant conversations after Thanksgiving, that he had asked her questions she hadn't been asked before. I didn't look for the details. I wasn't interested in watching her life unravel, or in cataloging what she deserved. I had spent too many years carrying quiet pain to find any pleasure in seeing that pain distributed somewhere else. My parents came to Ottawa in November, the weekend after we got the keys to the house. The place was half unpacked, boxes still stacked in the hall, the kitchen countertops still the old laminate we hadn't replaced yet. My mother walked through every room. She looked at the backyard through the glass door. Just the fence we needed to put up and the stubborn late fall grass, and she was quiet for a while. Then she turned around and said, "You've been building this for a long time." "I have," I said. "We weren't paying attention." I let that sit. "We're going to do better," she said. I told her what I had needed to say for years, calmly and without cruelty. That I hoped so, and that I would believe it when I saw it. That forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. That one comes from inside and the other has to be rebuilt from the outside, through choices made consistently over time. She nodded and didn't argue with any of it. My father put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way he does when he doesn't have words, and I understood. Christmas that year was in our house for the first time. Elliot and I had decorated the living room the weekend before. We drove out to a farm in the county and chose a tree that was slightly too tall for the ceiling and had to be trimmed at the top, which we found funnier than it probably warranted. We made a playlist that went from Joni Mitchell to something too modern and then back to Ella Fitzgerald. We ordered food from 2 different places because we couldn't agree on appetizers and then laughed at how much we'd over-ordered. The guest list was small and deliberate. My parents, my aunt, Blythe and her girlfriend, who I was meeting for the first time and liked immediately. 2 of Elliot's colleagues from the hospital who didn't have family nearby. A nurse from Newfoundland who had come to Ottawa for a position and hadn't gone back. And a resident from Saskatoon who was spending her first Christmas away from home. People who wanted to be there, gathered around a table that wasn't quite big enough, elbows occasionally touching, the radiator knocking in the old way of radiators in Ottawa houses built before the war. My mother brought butter tarts from the bakery in Hamilton she had been going to since I was small. She handed me the box at the door and then looked around the front hall. At the coat rack Elliot had installed, at the wreath I'd bought from a vendor at the Byward Market, at the light coming through from the living room, and her face did something it hadn't done when looking at me in a very long time. It settled. Not surprised, not expectant, just settled, the way a face does when it recognizes something it should have seen sooner. We ate. Someone knocked over a candle. Outside, the first real snow of December had been falling since the afternoon, and the street was white and still in the way Ottawa streets get in the deep part of winter, hushed and particular and clean. My father raised his glass near the end of the meal. He does not do that often. He is not a man who makes toasts, but he raised his glass and said, "To Tatum and Elliot, to building something on your own terms." I looked at him across the table. He looked back. Something in that exchange was worth more than every conversation we'd never had. Not because it erased anything. I am not someone who believes a good December rewrites a difficult history. Trust is slow to rebuild and the habits of a family are deeply grooved, and real change happens in the accumulation of ordinary choices, not in a single night. I knew all of that. But I also knew what it felt like to sit at my own table, in my own home, with the person I had chosen, with people who had learned, some of them late, some of them at a cost, to actually see me. The life I had built wasn't loud. It hadn't announced itself with drama or public confrontations. It had just been assembled, quietly, through 8 years of early mornings and long flights and careful work, and one February snowstorm on Bank Street, where a line didn't move for 40 minutes and turned out to be exactly where I was supposed to be. People imagine that getting the last word is the victory, that the moment someone is finally silenced is the moment you win. But standing there in my own kitchen on a snowy December night in Ottawa, I understood something I hadn't known how to put into words before. The real victory was never the Thanksgiving table. It was the 40 minutes in the snowstorm, the trail in April, the keys we picked up in November, the butter tarts from Hamilton and the slightly too tall Christmas tree and the radiator that knocked in the night. The real victory was all of it, steady and ordinary and completely finally mine.